Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time when Renaissance feasts were lavish, long, and full of strange rules you didn't know you needed. Picture it, you walk into a stone hall lit by flickering torches and chandeliers dripping with wax. The scent of roasted game cinnamon and too many unwashed nobles clings to the air like a gossip. Musicians are already warming up, your feet echo on cold tiles, and everyone turns to look. You realize you forgot your ceremonial napkin hat. Just kidding, sort of. You might not survive this, especially without a fork, because yes, those tiny trident things we now lose in the dishwasher haven't even made the guest list yet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I love knowing who else is drifting off with Renaissance turkey legs in their dreams. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward slowly, trying not to trip on your own slightly too long tunic. The feast hasn't started, but the hall is already buzzing. You pass beneath painted wooden beams and banners flapping in some indoor draft that no one seems to control. A harpist plucks uncertain notes in the corner, while a servant hurries past carrying a platter piled with roasted chestnuts and mild panic. Your shoes feel wrong. Everything does, really. You're wearing leather soles on stone floors, and there's no carpet to keep your dignity intact. Meanwhile, your host, some minor noble with a major ego, sits on an oversized chair at the far end of the room. That's not technically a throne, but definitely thinks it is. This is a banquet, not a dinner, not a potluck, a banquet, which means you're about to sit through multiple courses of meticulously prepared food served at a pace that could humble molasses. The menu might include 40 items, many with the names like Boar's Delight or Nun's Size, and half of them are spelled in Latin to confuse both you and the kitchen. Mainstream historical fact. Renaissance banquets were not just meals, they were displays of power, wealth, and cultural superiority. Each element from the menu to the seating chart was a deliberate statement. You're guided to your spot by a steward who clearly doesn't care if you live or die as long as you don't touch the sweetmeats too early. The table is absurdly long, wide enough to discourage whispering and intimate conversation. Everything is candlelit, which seems romantic, until you realize it also means you can't see what's in your stew. Before you sit, you notice something odd: no forks. Not a single one. Just knives, spoons, and your own questionable dexterity. That's because despite their invention centuries earlier, forks hadn't yet become standard across Europe. In some circles, they were still considered unmanly, or even sinfully delicate. So tonight, you'll be using your fingers. Daintily, of course. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some Renaissance courts, forks did exist, but only for serving candied fruit. Using them for meat was considered either effeminate or downright foreign, which in certain regions was apparently worse than just licking your fingers in public. Historians still argue whether the slow adoption of forks was due to religious conservatism, cultural stubbornness, or the general Renaissance love for eating like stylish barbarians. Maybe all three. Your table neighbor is a countess with more rings than fingers, and a wig that probably has tenants. She doesn't look up as you sit. That's fine. You're not sure what to say to someone wearing pearls on her elbows anyway. In front of you lies a trencher, basically a chunk of day-old bread hollowed out to hold food. It's your plate. It will soak up sauces and maybe, just maybe, be thrown to the dogs later, depending on how good your manners are. It smells faintly of ale and regret. From the far end of the hall, your host raises a goblet the size of your head. Silence ripples down the table. A toast is given something grand about loyalty, prosperity, and not letting the French win. Everyone murmurs in agreement, even though no one really heard him. Then the first course begins. It's not what you expect. No soup, no salad, Just a parade of small bites, pickled vegetables, hard cheese, possibly a snail, if your luck's bad. Everything is arranged more for looks than taste. You nibble cautiously, remembering not to chew, with your mouth open, or heaven forbid, speak while chewing. That could exile you to the lesser table, also known as the cold draft corner. Servants glide around in synchronized chaos, refilling cups and placing bowls of mysterious stuff you're expected to praise immediately. You do your best. You say. So, creamy, it's vinegar custard. You hear a faint squabble over salt placement. Apparently one guest crossed the salt cellar without permission, which in this crowd is just short of declaring war. You lean back and observe this isn't just dinner, it's a dance, a test, a social performance wrapped in goose fat and pageantry, and you're just getting started. You shift slightly on the wooden bench, unforgiving, and polish to an unnatural shine and try to focus on the next challenge of the evening, your outfit. Not because you're vain, but because wearing this thing might slowly break your spine. Getting dressed for a Renaissance banquet is no casual affair. It's not enough to smell tolerable and brush your teeth with crushed mint leaves and desperation. Oh no, your clothes speak before you do, and if they say the wrong thing, you might find yourself demoted from noble guest to curious peasant who wandered in. You're wrapped in layers, yes, layers. Multiple fabrics, some of which feel like burlap, others like polished wallpaper. Velvet sleeves puff out from your shoulders like inflatable arm floaties. A brocade doublet squeezes your torso with the affection of a boa constrictor. And over it all, a surcoat that has exactly zero insulation properties, but does make you look like a man-sized chess piece. Your shoes are pointed. Why? Because nothing says status like footwear that can't be used for walking. Mainstream historical fact. During the Renaissance, fashion was heavily regulated by sumptuary laws which dictated what you could wear based on your social rank. Silk ermine or cloth of gold only for the elite. Lower classes caught wearing noble fabrics could be fined or worse. You reach up to adjust your hat, or rather your hat structure. It's stiff wide and feels more like architecture than clothing. You try not to knock over the guest beside you every time you move your head. The hat alone could get you through a small snowstorm. Sadly, it cannot help you digest capon in almond sauce. The woman across the table dabs at her forehead with a square of lace while trying not to smear the white lead makeup clinging to her skin like plaster. It's a look, and I just walked out of a marble sculpture gallery kind of look. You realize uncomfortably that your own face is alarmingly shiny in comparison. You consider powdering your cheeks with breadcrumbs, then wisely choose to sip wine instead. Quirky tidbit cod pieces, the exaggerated padded fabric flaps, attached to men's trousers were not just fashion statements, but occasionally used as pouches for coins, while letters, or very tragically, snacks. Yes, someone somewhere probably stored raisins in there. You glance down and give thanks that your own codpiece is modest, by comparison-ish. Historians still argue whether the codpiece evolved purely as a practical garment to cover the gap created by tight hose, or whether it quickly became a full-blown fashion flex born of Renaissance swagger. Either way, once someone embroidered theirs with gold thread, the arms race began. A trumpet blares somewhere behind you, reminding you that another course is arriving soon. You shift again, grimacing as your sleeve gets temporarily trapped beneath your neighbor's ceremonial dagger. She apologizes without looking up. You both know the etiquette, pretend it didn't happen, and definitely don't bleed on the table linens. The mood is firming slightly. You see laughter ripple among the guests as they compare brooches and fabricated stories about recent falconing adventures. You're tempted to make something up. Yes, I once hunted a duck with a spoon, you whisper. No one hears you, which is probably for the best. A servant pauses to refill your goblet. You thank him, but he doesn't respond. He's been trained not to. Eye contact might lead to conversation, and that's too modern for this crowd. You try to lean back casually, but remember the back of your doublet is reinforced with something approximating ship timber. Relaxing is for peasants, or maybe for later after the third course when people stop pretending to like quince jelly. A young man down the table adjusts the folds of his cloak for the 100th time. You watch him sigh dramatically as he realizes his embroidery doesn't catch the candlelight quite as much as he'd hoped. Fashion envy even here. Another woman with crimson gloves and a neckline that defies geometry waves her feathered fan twice and then drops it into her lap. A servant rushes over to retrieve it. You're not sure if that was an accident or some sort of coded request for more wine, possibly both. You wonder briefly how long it takes to get into one of these outfits. Hours, probably. With help. And pins. Lots of pins. You try not to think about how you'll get out of yours later. You already suspect that at least one tie behind your back has been permanently fused into the fabric. At some point, someone compliments your belt. You beam. It's the one thing you didn't borrow. As the scent of roasted meat fills the air again, you begin to notice that everyone is starting to loosen slightly. Not their clothes, heavens, no, but their posture, their tone. The room is filled with the sound of soft conversation, clinking goblets, and the faint strain of a lute player absolutely mangling a love ballad in the corner. You take a deep breath. Yes, your sleeves are absurdly heavy. Yes, you're sweating in places you didn't know existed. But for a fleeting moment you feel strangely fabulous. And then someone accidentally dips their sleeve into the gravy boat and the spell is broken. The scent of cloves and roasted meat drifts past your nose again as the second course arrives louder than the first. Not louder in volume, but somehow louder in ambition. A silver platter is carried in by two servants balanced between them, like a sacrificial offering, and on it, a swan. Yes, a swan, not alive, but definitely redressed in its own feathers. You blink. The swan blinks not at all. It's stuffed with something likely another bird and garnished with sprigs of rosemary and what looks suspiciously like gilded grapes. Someone claps. You can't tell if they're impressed or confused. Mainstream historical fact. Renaissance banquets often featured illusion foods, dishes designed to look like something they weren't or prepared in overly dramatic fashion. Entire animals were roasted, then redressed in their feathers or fur, sometimes even posed in lifelike stances for maximum flair. You look around to gauge other reactions. The lady 3 seats down is unimpressed. The man beside her is sketching the bird on a napkin like it's his future dinner memoir. You poke at your trencher, suddenly aware that swan isn't even the weirdest thing on the table. That honor might go to the jelly tower next to it, some precarious wobble of fruit and bone broth that smells both sweet and meaty. You are now fully immersed in what the Renaissance elite considered fine dining. It's more theater than nourishment. Every course is a performance, a spectacle meant to astonish guests and whisper no. Shout, "Look how wealthy and clever I am." A servant ladles a thin broth into a shallow bowl in front of you. It's spiced with saffron, parsley, and possibly raisins. You take a sip. It's warm, mild, and a little unsettling, like drinking a tea that can't decide if it wants to be soup. Quirky tidbit. Some feasts included subtleties, sugar sculptures molded into castles, mythical creatures, or scenes from local gossip. Occasionally, these edible artworks contained small mechanical parts that moved. Nothing says romance like a marzipan knight jousting on a plate beside your turnip. Historians still argue whether these spectacles were purely for visual awe or also served deeper political purposes. Was the jellied unicorn a flex or a coded insult to the French ambassador? We may never know. Your spoon clinks against the bowl as you finish the broth and politely nudge the next dish closer. It's a roast, gamey and gleaming, possibly venison, possibly something that lost an argument in the woods. It's been stewed in wine and prunes. You take a bite and realize it tastes distant, like something that traveled far to find your mouth and still isn't sure it wants to be there. To your left, a noble with a ruff the size of a satellite dish sighs deeply before launching into a monologue about the proper way to tenderize goose. You nod along, pretending to be interested, while trying not to imagine how many birds have met their fate on his chopping block. Mid-bite, you remember no forks. You're eating soft meat with your fingers trying to appear graceful, while occasionally licking your thumb and immediately feeling the judgment of centuries pressing down upon you. Everyone's doing it, but still there's a silent art to this. The idea is to act like it's perfectly natural to eat duck à l'orange, like you're auditioning for a Renaissance-themed ASMR channel. From across the room, a murmur begins to ripple. A new dish has arrived, pastry shaped like a fish, complete with painted scales and a red currant for an eye. You lean forward just as the pastry is sliced open to reveal not fish, but spiced pears and nuts. It's delicious, or at least interesting enough to distract you from the fact that your doublet is starting to pinch and one of your shoes might be filled with gravy. It's fine. You're fine. The servants continue their dance, sweeping in, clearing away used trenchers, placing new ones down with terrifying efficiency. You try to thank one, but again, no response. It's not rudeness, it's choreography. They've been trained to move like shadows, except when they trip on a stray goblet, which just happened. Someone gasps, someone laughs, someone else yells, "Fetch the dog," which is somehow not the weirdest sentence of the night. You take a sip of your spiced wine, which now tastes slightly more vinegary than earlier. Either it's breathing or it's aging rapidly in your goblet. You don't question it, you just keep sipping. By now the food is arriving faster than you can keep up. There's a capon, basically a chicken that's been to finishing school. There's a baked eel pie, its crust shaped like a cathedral dome. There's a vegetable medley attempting to impersonate a painting, and there's a large pot of something called blancmange, which is not dessert despite its name and jiggly nature. It's shredded chicken, almond milk rice, and optimism. Your stomach starts to whisper that it might revolt. You whisper back, "We've made it this far, buddy." You're not full exactly, but you're definitely overwhelmed by flavors, by aromas, by the sheer spectacle of food that wants to be art, but also dinner. It's like every dish has an existential crisis before it reaches your plate. You glance at your fellow guests. Some are leaning back, satisfied. Others continue to eat like they're training for a medieval marathon. The noise in the hall has grown. Laughter now comes freely. Stories are traded. Someone starts humming. You catch a snatch of conversation about a cook who once sculpted a roast peacock holding a miniature harp made from sugar glass. You want that story to be true. You decide it is. A new platter is placed before you. It's small, simple poached pears in rosewater syrup. You take a bite. It's soft, cooling, sweet, a moment of quiet in the chaos. And for a moment you understand the appeal of this strange, excessive ritual. It's not just about food. It's about theater status absurdity and occasionally, surprisingly, joy. The air is thick now, not just with aromas of meat, wine, and exotic spices, but with the rising warmth of candle flames and flushed guests leaning in for quieter, more mischievous conversation. The feast, it seems, is just getting comfortable with itself. You're deep enough into the evening that your sleeves feel like part of your body, and your posture has surrendered to the chair's slow betrayal of your spine. You shift your attention to the people around you, no longer just blurred outlines in extravagant fabrics, but individual characters playing their roles on the stage of Renaissance etiquette. Each one a walking illustration of social ambition, ancient family pride, or a very expensive tailor's wildest dream. Mainstream historical fact. In Renaissance Europe, banquets were not only about food, they were a highly ritualized performance of status. Every gesture, seating arrangement, and conversational opening was carefully weighed. You didn't just attend a banquet, you navigated one. To your left, a man with a mustache so waxed it could deflect arrows is recounting a falconry mishap that may or may not have involved a bishop's wig. Across the table, a noblewoman with more pearls than neckline is laughing behind her fan, though whether she's amused or merely being polite, you'll never know. That's the thing, Renaissance etiquette is like a card game where no one shows their hand and everyone assumes you've read the rule book backward in Latin. You make the mistake of reaching for bread with your left hand. A small cough sounds from a server nearby, a subtle passive-aggressive nudge that you've breached protocol. You quickly switch to the right, crisis averted, for now. Quirky tidbit. There was an actual manual of manners called Il Galateo, published in the 16th century by Giovanni della Casa, which advised that one should avoid scratching oneself, spitting, or placing one's hand where it ought not be. The fact that these tips had to be written down says a lot about Renaissance dinner parties. You watch as the man at the far end of the table unfolds a napkin with all the ceremony of someone handling royal documents. He drapes it delicately over his shoulder. Bold move. Napkins are relatively new at this point in history, evolving from shared cloths at communal hand-washing stations to individual squares for blotting grease and shame. You look down at your own napkin, still folded like a worried swan. You decide to follow the man's lead and drape it across your lap instead. It feels right, like wearing armor to a conversation about tax policy. Historians still argue whether these dining behaviors were rooted in actual hygiene concerns or if they developed purely to signal class and refinement. After all, what better way to assert your superiority than to use a specific spoon for quince paste and another for pine nut custard? Speaking of cutlery, you're reminded once again that forks are not part of this world, not yet. They exist, sure, but mostly in Italy, and even then, they're often considered suspect, effeminate, foreign. You've heard whispers of theologians calling them pronged instruments of vanity. Imagine being judged by your salad tongs. Instead, you scoop and stab with a combination of knife-spoon and the two utensils God gave you, your fingers. The idea is to appear elegant while awkwardly juggling lamb stew and dignity. It's not going well. At the next table, a young courtier discreetly spits an olive pit into a napkin, tucks it into his sleeve, and keeps smiling. You make a note to avoid shaking hands later. Another servant approaches, this time carrying a silver basin and pitcher. Hand washing round 2. You extend your hands as warm water is poured over them and a cloth is offered. The ritual is soothing, and for a brief moment, you forget that your shoes still squish slightly from earlier gravy trauma. The conversation around you drifts from music to astrology, and then inevitably to fashion. Someone is debating whether sleeves should be puffed, slashed, or both. Someone else insists that blue dyed with imported indigo should now be considered more noble than traditional madder red. You resist the urge to suggest sweat-wicking linen. That would be too modern, too practical, too peasant. Suddenly a hush falls. A new guest is arriving late, announced by a flurry of whispers and a gust of rose-scented air. She's dressed in what appears to be an embroidered constellation. Gold stars glint from her hem, and every head turns as she glides to her seat. You're reminded again that banquets are performances, and everyone here is painfully aware of their audience. A misplaced word, a clumsy toast, a sauce stain in the wrong direction, all of it catalogued silently by onlookers, who smile sweetly while remembering every faux pas for later gossip. You reach for your wine goblet again and raise it, unsure if you're meant to be toasting. The man beside you nods, so you nod back. It's an unspoken agreement. No one really knows what's going on, but we're all too well dressed to admit it. The lady across from you drops her spoon. A servant retrieves it instantly. She apologizes without words, only a raised eyebrow and a downward glance. The moment passes like mist over hot pudding. As you spoon what might be mashed chestnut into your mouth, you reflect on the sheer precision of this world. Even laughter is carefully calibrated. Too loud and you seem vulgar, too soft and you risk fading into irrelevance. You chuckle at a nearby joke about constellations and cheese rinds, hoping you've hit the right volume. The host, an older gentleman with a beard trimmed into geometrical defiance, stands slowly raising his goblet for a toast. You quickly do the same, wincing slightly as your elbow brushes the carved armrest that has haunted your funny bone all evening. His speech is florid, reverent, and just slightly too long. You admire the commitment. He thanks the guests, praises the kitchen staff, and blesses the season's harvest in one breath. You sip in synchronized solidarity when he finishes the wine, warming your chest and numbing your memory of that awkward bread incident earlier. The night deepens. The flames flicker lower. The background music shifts to something gentler, more introspective. The tempo of the feast slows, not ended, not yet, but easing toward whatever pageantry is next. You lean back, allowing yourself to rest just a little. No one seems to mind anymore. Even the swan on its platter looks slightly more relaxed. You hear it before you see it, a soft trilling of lutes, a flute like a breath through fine lace, and then with theatrical timing the doors open once more. A pair of musicians enter, followed by a harlequin in bells, and a mask with a nose that could double as a fencing foil. Ah, yes, entertainment, because nothing complements a heavy meal like light performance and carefully rehearsed whimsy. You shift in your seat, feeling the seam of your tunic pulling slightly across your back, proof that no matter how refined a dinner might be, there's always that post-meal regret. But there's no time for that now. A new phase of the banquet is underway, and you are, whether you like it or not, still on display. Mainstream historical fact. It was customary in the Renaissance to intersperse courses with intermezzi, short performances of music, dance, or comic sketches. These weren't casual acts. They were orchestrated spectacles meant to reflect the host's wealth, taste, and ability to hold your attention longer than your digestion could. The harlequin prances forward, twirling a stick with streamers, and delivers a speech that would make a Netflix exec nervous, half-rhyming, half-scandalous, and full of thinly veiled references to courtly gossip. You're not sure whether to laugh or nod solemnly, so you settle for a smile and an internal reminder that you really need to learn more court Italian. Just as the jesters retreat, two dancers enter, wearing veils so long they trail like silken shadows. They glide through patterns that are part ballet, part symbolic ritual, part don't trip on the roast goose. It's beautiful in a slightly hypnotic way, like watching smoke swirl or your cousin explain cryptocurrency. Quirky tidbit. In some wealthier courts, entertainment included trained animals, performing tricks like bears riding ponies or parrots reciting Latin prayers. Historians suspect at least one parrot may have been canonically more fluent in church Latin than several monks. The audience claps politely, if not particularly enthusiastically. Etiquette demands it, and so the rhythm of appreciation must be upheld. No one claps too loudly, and no one dares to not clap at all. You're part of a choreography more complex than the dances themselves. A servant passes with a tray of spiced wine in delicate cups. You accept one, gratefully savoring the sweetness, the cinnamon, the faint kick of clove that clings to your teeth. The drink warms you from the inside, or perhaps it's just the sheer quantity of food, turning your blood into gravy. Somewhere to your right, two older women are whispering behind fans, one peeking over hers like a falcon hunting mice. You catch snatches of phrases: Duchess of Ferrara, third course, and something that sounds suspiciously like goat pie incident. You make a mental note never to underestimate the weaponized power of bored nobility. Historians still argue whether these entertainments were truly enjoyed or merely endured, a necessary social performance to mask awkward silences and distract from long waits between dishes. After all, without electric stoves or microwaves, Even the finest kitchen needed time to whip up a sugar-crusted peacock stuffed with almond paste. Your eyes are drawn to the far end of the hall where a man in crimson robes unfurls a long scroll and begins to read a sonnet. It is long. It is heartfelt. It may have been written entirely in metaphors about pomegranates. He's either a poetic genius or just very, very lonely. You give a nod of deep faux reflection and take another sip of your wine. You think back to the first course and wonder vaguely if you'll ever feel your belt again. The progression of dishes has been slow, deliberate, each one a signal in the larger symphony of the evening. And now, with entertainment interlaced between sips and sighs, you realize that time at a Renaissance banquet moves differently, less like a ticking clock, more like a sundial on a partly cloudy day. A murmur rises around the room as a small platform is wheeled in, and atop it something astonishing, a dessert castle made entirely of sugar. Not frosting, sugar, sculpted walls, turrets, tiny flags waving in the candlelight. The entire thing glistens like it might break into song. And yes, mainstream historical fact confirm Renaissance banquets often ended with what were called subtleties or entremets, elaborate edible art pieces designed to dazzle the eye far more than the tongue. These were rarely meant to be eaten in full, and many guests just stared at them reverently, unsure if biting into a sugar sculpture of Hercules would be considered heroic or rude. You marvel at the details. A tiny sugar knight leans against a candy lance. A powdered sugar moat glints under almond paste bridges. The castle is flanked by marzipan hedges shaped like mythical beasts. One of them might be a griffin, one might be a dog. Or perhaps the sculptor had never seen either. Quirky as it sounds, these displays were serious business. A host might spend a small fortune on a sugar sculpture, especially imported sugar, to impress guests and flex cultural muscle. Sugar was expensive, exotic, and alarmingly addictive. Kind of like Renaissance Twitter, but in powder form. A musician picks up a lute again, this time playing something slower, more contemplative. The mood shifts. Bellies are full, jokes are fewer now, and faces are glowing with wine and fatigue. It's the lull before the final crescendo, like the part of a dream when you realize you're floating just above the ground. The host stands once more. He thanks the performers, the kitchen, the guests. It's all very gracious. But there's something almost desperate in his smile, as though he knows this exact evening will never happen again, and he wants to memorize every moment like a child clutching the tail end of summer. As applause rolls like soft thunder, you feel your own mind start to wander. You're no longer thinking about where the cutlery goes or whether your laugh was the right volume. You're just here, a full guest at a table of full people, watching dancers step lightly between shadows and firelight, watching a sugar castle melt just slightly in the warmth of the room. You lean back, you breathe in honey meat and candle wax, you let the lute guide you toward stillness. The lute player fades into the background, plucking gently like he's cradling your dreams instead of strings. You stretch slightly, careful not to look too relaxed. Slouching is a subtle crime in high company, somewhere between forgetting a noble's name and sneezing mid-prayer. The air is softer now. People murmur rather than speak their voices, melting into the candlelit haze that coats the banquet hall like old velvet. A servant sidles past you with an ornate pitcher and tops off your cup with wine so dark it might be plotting something. You nod in silent thanks, the kind that says, yes, I will have more, and no, I don't need to see solid food for another 6 months. And yet dessert, because while the sugar castle is a marvel to behold, it's not the final course. Oh no, the Renaissance palate, well-fed though it may be, is not done having opinions. There is still one last flourish to come, and it's not going to be a quick bite of biscotti and bed. Mainstream historical fact. Renaissance desserts were often elaborate, layered, and spiced. Think tarts, filled with custard and fruit. Marzipan sculptures, sweetmeats in delicate boxes, and jellied confections shimmering like stained glass. If it could wobble, sparkle, or cause your dentist to faint, it was on the menu. Tonight, it's a saffron almond tart, inlaid with candied rose petals. You bite into it and the crust flakes like warm parchment. The filling is floral, creamy, and mysterious, like it might have a secret past. You nod in appreciation, even as your body begins to negotiate terms with your digestive system. It's mostly just whimpering. Across the table, a man in elaborate sleeves tries to delicately remove a seed from his mouth. He fails. The seed clings to his lip like a rebellious student. You pretend not to notice, as any good court guest would. There are rules about these things. Rule 1, embarrassment is a group denial project. Now, if you thought dessert was the end, you sweet summer child, you have not yet experienced banquet finales. These are not dessert, not quite. They're a postscript, just one more thing in the form of what's known as the voidee. Quirky tidbit. A voidee was a small offering of spiced wine or digestive nibbles, candied anise, ginger, fennel seeds, meant to help the stomach void itself before bed. Yes, that was the real intention, because nothing says thanks for coming like handing your guest something mildly medicinal while they stagger toward the latrine. Tonight's voidee is a tiny ceramic tray with candied orange peel, perfumed lozenges, and what you think is a sugared violet. You pop it into your mouth and it tastes like what a Renaissance poem smells like: floral, strange, slightly bitter, oddly lovely. You feel vaguely restored or possibly bewitched. The servants, those tireless dancers in wool and linen, begin clearing the table, not just the plates but the tablecloths, carefully lifting the entire covering in one graceful pull, revealing a second, finer cloth underneath. This is not dinner. This is stagecraft. Even the linens have costume changes. Historians still argue whether these finale moments, these voidees, were more symbolic than practical. Some believe they were part of a ritualized wind down, a kind of edible punctuation mark on an evening of spectacle. Others insist it was just an excuse to eat sugared coriander and drink clove wine while talking about everyone who left early. A servant returns this time with a basin and ewer. You hold out your hands as warm rosewater is poured across your fingers. The scent is dreamy, and for a fleeting moment, you feel like royalty in a toothpaste commercial. A fresh linen towel is offered. You dry your hands slowly, savoring the texture. Another wave of musicians steps forward, not for performance, but to signal the end. This time, they play something slow, wistful. You can't hum it, not exactly. It's more of a mood than a melody, like a sigh turned into sound. Conversation begins to rise again, this time with the easy cadence of people no longer pretending to be impressed. Now it's about who drank too much, who spilled the sauce, and who, legend has it, once mistook a marzipan swan for a centerpiece and bit off its head before anyone could stop him. No names, of course, but plenty of side eyes. You lean back, fingers laced across your lap, utterly full, utterly content, and maybe, just maybe, dreaming of your bed. The chairs may be carved from cherry wood and draped in velvet, but your spine is writing angry poetry with every vertebra. The host rises once more, less grandly this time. He raises a cup only slightly stained with the evening's festivities and offers a final toast. It's in the language of the court, flowery and full of metaphors about stars and grapes. You raise your cup too, hoping no one notices it's mostly empty. You nod at the right time, smile at the flourish, and make a mental note that tomorrow you will absolutely not eat anything until at least next Thursday. You file out with the others, moving slowly, reverently. Your breath fogs slightly in the hallway air, cooler than the heat-soaked banquet room. You feel the weight of the evening in your bones, your belt, and your soul. As you reach for your cloak, someone slips you a folded note. No signature, no flourish, just a smear of sugared plum on the corner. You'll read it later when you're horizontal and emotionally prepared. And just before you exit into the night, you glance back one last time. The candles flicker, the sugar castle has begun to slump, the musicians are packing up, and the table, now bare again, waits silently for the next round of stories and sauces. The door creaks gently as it closes behind you, sealing in the heat, the clatter, the bellyful of everything. Outside, the air is brisk and unperfumed. No roasting game birds here, just dew and chimney smoke and the faint aroma of wet cobblestone. You pull your cloak tighter and begin the quiet walk home, each step loosening the grip of all that etiquette. But this isn't the end of your Renaissance dining education. Not yet. Because while you just survived the dinner barely, you haven't yet faced dining etiquette, the battlefield of manners, posture, and perilous cutlery that decides whether you rise in society or get side-eyed by someone in a feathered hat. And tonight, you didn't use a fork. Nobody did. Mainstream historical fact. Despite forks having existed for centuries, they weren't common at most Renaissance European tables until the 17th century. In many regions, eating with fingers, knives, or spoon-like utensils was the norm. Fingers were precise tools, and anything more was often seen as exotic, unnecessary, or downright suspicious. You'd think not having forks would make things simpler. Just pick up a roast duck leg and go full medieval rite. But no, there were rules. Finger food didn't mean sloppy food, no licking, no loud chewing, no double dipping into the communal mustard pot. And yes, there was usually a communal mustard pot. You, humble guest, were expected to bring your own knife, not to threaten the host or slice up your rivals, though that was occasionally a bonus feature, but to cut your food into dignified mouth-sized pieces. You'd wipe your blade discreetly on a crust of bread or on the edge of your trencher, a stale slice of flat bread doubling as a plate. Napkins, if you were lucky. If not, your sleeve paid the price. Quirky tidbit. Some Renaissance hosts actually provided guests with personalized spoons or knives, engraved with proverbs, religious warnings, or passive-aggressive reminders like fear God and chew with thy mouth shut. That last one may or may not be real. But you believe it, don't you? A proper diner would break bread with the person to their left as a gesture of goodwill. You'd slice your portion, dip it in broth or sauce, and offer the choicest morsels to your social superiors, hoping, of course, they didn't return the favor with something that had already touched their tongue. Historians still argue whether this method of eating, so intimate, so hands-on, was actually more hygienic than early utensil use, especially given how infrequently forks were cleaned properly once they did arrive. Some point out that at least fingers got washed with rose water between courses, while wooden utensils often went weeks between soap and sanity. And about that rose water, it wasn't just for looks. It acted as a rudimentary cleanser and perfume, covering the aroma of garlic-heavy meals and helping your fingers smell more like garden party and less like stewed mutton. There were other rituals, too. You'd never reach across the table. That was basically social heresy. Instead, you'd ask someone nearby to do you the service of passing the salt. Yes, the salt. That critical divider of class. If you sat above the salt, closer to the host, you were somebody. Below the salt, well, better luck next feast. Your host's eyes were everywhere. Not in a creepy way, but in the very polite, hovering way of someone who needs this night to go smoothly. They noticed if you wiped your mouth before drinking. They noted if your elbows stayed off the table. They definitely clocked whether you used the correct hand for toasting the right one. Left-handed toasts were once thought demonic in some circles. And there was the conversation, too, delicate, choreographed, and deeply strategic. No politics, no theology unless you wanted to start a rebellion, and certainly no discussion of bodily functions. You talked about art, music, weather, trade routes, or if you were very brave, spice prices. If you laughed too loud, leaned too close, or burped too proudly, your name would be remembered, just not fondly. But etiquette wasn't just about avoiding social doom. It was in its own twisted way part of the entertainment. Guests observed one another like dancers on a floor, each move an echo of grace or clumsiness. A fallen spoon could become a legend, a well-folded napkin, quietly legendary. You remember a moment from earlier, someone at the far end of the table sneezed mid-bite. No handkerchief, no warning, time slowed, a ripple of silence, and then without a word, a servant stepped in with such fluidity it might have been choreographed by angels. The sneezer bowed their head in apology, cheeks aflame, while the rest of the table politely stared at their pairs. That's etiquette for you, not a cage, but a stage. You aren't locked into behavior, you're performing it. With bread in one hand and a blade in the other, you toe the line between barbarian and bard. By now your boots scrape familiar streets. The sounds of the feast are far behind you, replaced by the hush of sleeping chickens and the soft creak of wooden signs swinging in the breeze. You're warm from the wine, sore from the sitting, and slightly wiser about how not to embarrass yourself with poultry legs. You pause before your door, half smiling at the thought of trying to explain all this to someone back home. Dinner was good, you'd say. We had meat pie. I touched it with my fingers and didn't die. And as you step inside, light a taper, and kick off your shoes, you reflect on the strange dignity of it all. The unspoken codes, the crumb-flecked hierarchy, the cutlery-free high-wire act of Renaissance dining etiquette. Forks may not have been welcome at the table, but rules, oh, they were feasting with you every step of the way. You're not entirely sure how it happens, but somehow you find yourself back at the same table the next evening. Maybe it's the warm bread, maybe it's the intrigue, or maybe you're simply afraid of what happens if you don't show up. Imagine being blacklisted from tripe night. Either way, you're here again, and this time you've got your eye on something beyond the bread and pears. Tonight you're looking at presentation, because Renaissance cuisine wasn't just about what you ate, but how it strutted its way onto your plate. Mainstream historical fact. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, banquet presentation had become a form of pageantry often called subtleties, or entremets, with food sculpted into everything from castles to swans. It was performance art for the palate. And oh, it was competitive, your host eager to impress the noble in the third seat from the salt orders. An entire roasted boar carried in on a wooden platform, its mouth stuffed with apples, its tusks gilded its body. Singing, okay, maybe not literally, but it looks like it should sing. These weren't mere centerpieces, they were edible status updates. A pie might arrive with live birds fluttering out of it, just like in that nursery rhyme. The trick, they were hidden in a hollow pastry shell after baking, not baked with the birds. You're welcome? Quirky tidbit. Some desserts were made to appear savory, like molded marzipan shaped into roasted pigeons or bacon. This trompe-l'oeil dining game confused the eyes and delighted the diners. You might cut into what looks like a hunk of meat and discover it's actually almond paste dyed with beetroot juice. Surprise, no protein, but plenty of flair. Historians still argue whether these elaborate displays were primarily for the aristocracy's amusement, or whether they serve deeper symbolic purposes, reinforcing power, divine favor, or just plain absurd wealth. After all, nothing says, I own land, and peasants like pudding shaped like a cathedral. You notice that while you humble attendee have one trencher of mostly identifiable food, the head table is practically an edible carnival. There's a tower of sugar-coated almonds shaped like a fortress, a gelatin mold the size of a child quivering with tragic dignity, a peacock feathers reattached after roasting posed like it's about to peck someone into submission. And let's talk about sugar. To modernize, sugar is sweet, benign, and honestly kind of necessary if you're dealing with this much mead. But here it's a weapon, a luxury, a status symbol that can rot your teeth and inflate your ego in equal measure. Only the rich could afford mountains of sugar, and boy did they flaunt it. Everything gets candied, ginger, carrots, even rose petals. You nibble something chewy and floral, and you're not sure if it's meant for dessert or potpourri. Doesn't matter, it's expensive, that's the point. And it isn't just the food. Even the plates fight for attention. At the upper echelons of society, dishes might be silver or pewter, though you're more likely to be eating off a hollowed-out loaf of stale bread, your trencher. At the end of the meal, the trencher is either fed to the poor or, if you're particularly hungry and reckless, eaten by you. There's a curious moment when the servants parade a new course in, and everyone turns to watch, not eat, just observe. It's all part of the ritual. You glance around and realize that half the people at this table are here to be seen dining as much as they are to dine. And because subtlety is so not a Renaissance thing, there are occasionally edible heraldic emblems. Yes, someone carved the family crest into the butter, and someone else's pudding has a poem baked into the crust. Is it legible? Barely. Is it romantic? Arguably. Does it rhyme? No. You raise a brow as another guest pokes gently at what appears to be a sugar-sculpted elephant holding a flag. It takes 3 servants to move it down the table. No one eats it. It's just there, as if silently screaming, "We don't need forks. We need attention." And still, there's a strange sincerity underneath it all. Because these dramatic presentations, overcooked swan feathers and gelatin lions and pies full of doves, aren't just pageantry. They're the equivalent of a Renaissance PowerPoint presentation. They're saying, look, we have wealth, we have ingredients, we have an entire kitchen staff working through the night, probably crying into their rags. And we want you to feel that. Of course, sometimes the extravagance goes hilariously wrong. You hear whispers about a nearby noble who once commissioned a cake shaped like a ship, complete with burning sugar cannons. It set the tablecloth on fire and nearly singed a bishop's beard. The memory lingers, passed down like an inside joke of culinary warfare. You think back to your modest life, maybe a bowl of pottage, a hard cheese, a warm mug of small beer. It seems downright refreshing now, simple, quiet, not likely to catch fire mid-meal. Still, it's hard not to be impressed as you sip your wine and watch someone peel back golden pastry to reveal what looks like a roasted hedgehog, except it's made of minced fruit and almond flour. Artistic, yes, delicious, debatable, unsettling entirely. As the hour grows late, dessert becomes more sculptural than edible. Sugar sculptures twist upward like candied coral reefs. Dried fruit towers crumble slowly, shedding raisins like autumn leaves. And someone just brought out a final flourish, a spinning wheel made of hardened honey and hazelnuts, possibly meant to represent the sun, or maybe just a reason to lose a molar. You lean back in your chair, stomach full, brain spinning eyes, adjusting to the candlelight flickering off gilded pears. You're not sure you'll remember the flavors, too many textures, too much spice. But the visuals burned into your memory like a creme brulee top. You didn't just eat. You witnessed. You survived an edible theater performance with no intermission and no intermission snacks because the snacks were the intermission. And as the final dish is cleared and the servants bow and your host rises with a self-satisfied gleam, you realize that forks may not have been invited, but excess absolutely was. The candles are shorter now, pools of wax gathering at their bases, like the final sigh of a long evening, and you're still perched at the table, half stuffed, half stunned. But there's no leaving yet, not until you've endured the social ritual that follows the meal. Because in Renaissance dining, eating was just the beginning. Now comes the sitting around pretending you're important part. And make no mistake, you are now deep in the etiquette weeds. If you thought not having a fork was hard, wait until you're trying to decode the unwritten rules of how to hold a cup without accidentally insulting someone 3 social ranks above you. Mainstream historical fact. Renaissance banquets, especially among nobility, were governed by strict hierarchies. Seating was carefully arranged based on social status, age, and favor. Even which dish you were served or whether you got access to the fresh bread versus the day-old slices could signal your place in the pecking order. You glance left, and there's someone who hasn't touched their food either because they're above it or more likely terrified of being seen chewing. Across from you, a guest gently dabs their lips with the corner of a linen napkin, not wiping, so much as whispering it against their skin like a lover's touch. You try it. You sneeze into your wine. Everyone saw. You recover quickly, mostly, as much as one can, considering the Renaissance version of small talk includes everything from debating the latest plague outbreaks to comparing who owns the more tastefully inlaid lute. Quirky tidbit. In some banquets, musicians were placed under the table, yes, actually underneath it, to provide a strange muffled soundtrack to your chewing. They were called minstrels' galleries, and while the sound was delightfully atmospheric, the image is a little haunting. You now picture a flutist below you trying not to breathe too loudly under your feet. Conversation here is almost choreographed. You don't speak unless spoken to by someone of higher rank. You don't compliment the food too aggressively, that's for the host to imply. You don't laugh too loudly unless the highest status person laughs first. And if someone makes a joke at your expense, you must chuckle lightly and pretend it was brilliant, even if it involved eel puns, especially if it involved eel puns. Historians still argue whether these hyper-controlled post-dinner rituals were meant to enforce political stability or simply to maintain the illusion of refinement among people who had just 30 minutes ago torn into a roast goose with their hands. And now, as if things couldn't get more precariously performative, the washing of the hands ritual begins again. This time with scented rosewater. Servants offer ornate basins, and you're meant to clean your fingertips delicately like you weren't just elbow deep in gravy 2 courses ago. Someone nearby burps politely behind a hand and murmurs, "Excusez-moi." You nod solemnly as if they've just recited a line of poetry. You begin to understand that in this world, gestures matter more than honesty. You could be plotting to poison half the court, but if you place your goblet down just right, everyone still thinks you're charming. There's music again this time from somewhere above, perhaps a balcony or a hidden choir loft. The tunes are slow melancholy, like a long exhale. You hum along faintly before realizing you're probably not allowed to do that. Best to just tap a toe under the table and pretend you're contemplating theology. You notice that no one's in a hurry to leave. That's because leaving first is a statement either you're too important to stay or too lowly to be missed. Either way, it's risky. So people linger. They sip more wine, tell stories with elaborate gestures, and pretend their tunics aren't slowly cutting off circulation to one leg. You're offered a final drink, Hippocras, a spiced wine sweetened with sugar and herbs. You take a cautious sip. It tastes like cinnamon-dried roses and bad decisions. But it's warm, and as the cup passes through your hands, you realize how many layers of significance are wrapped around every object at this table. Even the salt cellar, the container for salt, sits in a place of honor. To be seated above the salt meant you were important. Below the salt, you were a +1 at best. You glance down and, yep, below, deeply below. But don't take it personally. Most people were. You're lucky to even be here. And besides, your side of the table gets the better view of the court jester who's currently miming a knight dueling a sausage. Honestly, it's the most relatable part of the evening. You realize the mood is shifting. Plates are cleared, candles trimmed. Some guests lean in closer, dropping their voices as conversations turn more secretive. This is where alliances are hinted at. Gossip is traded and marriage proposals are lightly floated under the cover of a dessert wine haze. Still, there's a cozy intimacy to it all, even with the rules, even with the sheer performance of it. You're full, you're buzzed, and the flickering candlelight has blurred the hard lines of hierarchy into something more forgiving. Or maybe that's just the mead kicking in. You sit back, sigh softly, and take it all in. The murmur of voices, the glow of gold-painted plates, the gentle clink of pewter goblets, a room steeped in ritual and rose water, and somewhere in the shadows possibly a minstrel sneezing under the table. You wonder if 500 years from now someone will look back at your dinner parties and find them equally bizarre. Your takeout cartons, your foldable chairs, your refusal to make eye contact over pasta. Compared to this scene, your own dining rituals are delightfully low stakes and a lot less sticky. One by one, the nobles begin rising, some with poise, others with that very specific post-banquet wobble. You stand to bowing just deeply enough to suggest humility without seeming uncertain. You're learning. And as the crowd drifts toward the outer chambers, you follow slowly, savoring the scent of baked quince still hanging in the air, and wondering just how much of that elephant sculpture was sugar and how much was probably beeswax. No one will ever know, but that's okay. The food may disappear, the decorations crumble, but the ritual remains. The evening has worn on, but you're still not quite done, because what's a Renaissance banquet without entertainment? No, not your modern DJ, spinning tracks, or a casual acoustic guitar. This is a carefully choreographed spectacle, a mix of music, dance, poetry, and sometimes even a little political theater, all designed to dazzle and distract. Mainstream historical fact. Minstrels, jesters, and troubadours were regular fixtures at these banquets, hired not just for their talent, but for their ability to flatter patrons and poke fun without causing offense. Jesters could be dangerously funny, a fact not lost on anyone who's ever had to walk the fine line between humor and insult. You watch as the first performer takes the stage, or rather a cleared spot between tables. A harpist fingers delicate and precise weaving notes that float through the room like candle smoke. There's something intimate about live music here, softening the edges of all the grandiosity. Quirky tidbit. Sometimes entertainers would dress in elaborate costumes made of fruits, flowers, or even cooked meats. Yes, you heard that right, meat costumes. Imagine a performer waddling around in a suit of bacon or a hat decorated with roasted chickens. It was less about fashion and more about spectacle, and probably smelled like a butcher's shop on a hot day. Historians still argue whether these performances were purely for amusement, or whether they carried coded messages, political jabs, disguised as comedy secret signals, wrapped in verse. After all, subtlety wasn't just for the food, it was a survival skill. The jester, a wiry man with a painted face, starts a routine that has half the guests chuckling and the other half nervously clutching their goblets. His jokes are sharp but never cruel, well, except for the one about the Duke's wig that's seen more battles than the Duke himself. That one earns a few forced laughs and a quick change of subject. Then comes the dance. Not the casual two-step you might imagine, but an intricate ballet of bows, curtsies, and hand gestures that look like sign language for people who speak, "I'm very important." You try to follow along, but after a few awkward attempts, decide it's best to watch and learn, maybe for next banquet season. The dancers' costumes are heavy with symbolism, colors representing family alliances, embroidery telling stories of past victories, and jewels sewn in to catch candlelight and blind your enemies. You squint, trying to catch the subtle meanings, but mostly just enjoy the spectacle. Between acts, there's an interlude where a poet reads verses about love, honor, and the fleeting nature of life. The words are beautiful, if a little heavy-handed. You note the irony as someone raises a goblet of wine and laughs heartily, probably thinking easy for you to say when you don't have to eat with your fingers. Quirky tidbit number 2. In some banquets, animals were trained to perform tricks. Dogs danced on their hind legs, parrots recited snippets of court gossip, and on rare occasions trained bears would lumber about to everyone's nervous delight. You wonder if the bear ever got a fork. As the night deepens, you sense the atmosphere growing more relaxed, less rigid. Nobles begin exchanging whispered gossip, and some slip away to quieter rooms, for private conversations. You realize that the banquet is as much a political arena as it is a feast, a place where alliances are forged, broken, and reforged under the soft glow of chandeliers. You recall earlier debates among historians about whether Renaissance banquets helped stabilize power structures or simply masked simmering tensions beneath layers of sugar and spice. Watching the interplay now, you lean toward the latter. Behind every laugh is a calculating mind, and behind every toast a silent negotiation. Finally, the last performance, a somber, haunting lute solo, fills the room. It's a quiet reminder that all things must end, even banquets with no forks and enough sugar to rot a village. You feel the exhaustion settling in the buzz of wine and food slowing to a gentle hum. The servants begin clearing the final plates. The guests begin to rise, and you, having survived the feast and its theatrical demands, stand with a newfound appreciation for the art of Renaissance dining, where food was not just nourishment, but performance, politics, and sometimes pure chaos, wrapped in gold leaf. The banquet may be winding down, but your journey through Renaissance dining etiquette takes a curious turn now, the after-dinner customs. You might think once the plates are cleared and the last sips of wine are taken, everyone would simply leave and call it a night. But no, the Renaissance had its own unique way of extending the evening that's part ritual, part social endurance test. Mainstream historical fact. After the main meal, it was customary to have a dessert course that was more than just sweets. It included elaborate displays, sometimes involving live birds or intricate sugar sculptures that demonstrated the host's wealth and artistic taste. These were often referred to as subtleties, and they were a big deal. You watch as the servants wheel in a massive sculpture made entirely of sugar and marzipan, a castle with tiny knights and dragons perched atop the towers. The room erupts in polite applause. You wonder how anyone actually eats these, or if they're just there to be admired like Renaissance art you're not supposed to touch. Quirky tidbit. Some subtleties were so detailed that they included hidden compartments filled with spices or scented herbs which would release fragrance when warmed by candles nearby. You can almost imagine the confused look on a guest's face when a sugar dragon suddenly starts smelling like cinnamon and cloves. The subtle art of conversation continues here. People now speak more freely, laughter is a little louder, and the rigid formality starts to loosen just enough to keep things interesting without tipping into chaos. You lean in to overhear a debate about whether the new queen's taste in fabrics is appropriate for court, only to be distracted by the sight of a gentleman carefully polishing his nails with a small knife. Nail care, you learn, was another unspoken part of etiquette, especially for those who needed to look immaculate in front of potential patrons or rivals. Historians still argue whether these elaborate after-dinner customs were a way to reinforce social bonds or just an excuse for nobles to prolong their indulgence. You suspect it's a bit of both, especially considering how slowly the servants clear away the wine glasses. Now you notice the custom of passing the posset. This thick, warm drink made from milk, eggs, and spices is handed around to help settle the stomach and presumably prepare everyone for a night of storytelling or music. You take a sip. It tastes like a custard that's had one too many spice parties. Quirky tidbit number 2. Sometimes posset was served in ornate silver cups that had little compartments to hold medicinal herbs, turning the drink into both a comfort and a cure. It was the Renaissance's version of "this tea will fix your hangover." As the night grows late, some guests begin to engage in quiet games, chess dice, or riddles, while others retire to side chambers to exchange more intimate gossip or plot their next moves in court politics. You realize these after-meal gatherings weren't just about food or entertainment. They were crucial for building alliances, testing loyalties, and even planning marriages. Every glance, every laugh, every sip carried meaning far beyond what you might expect. You glance around feeling the room's warmth and the buzz of low conversations. This is more than a dinner party. It's a microcosm of Renaissance society itself, complex, ritualistic, and endlessly fascinating. As you prepare to leave the room, you think back to the earlier messiness of eating with your hands and the strange pleasure of those sugar sculptures. Tonight has been a dance between indulgence and decorum, chaos and control, all under the watchful eyes of history. You step away from the banquet hall already nostalgic for the strange, sticky, wonderful world of Renaissance dining. As the night deepens, your journey takes you to one of the lesser-known yet essential aspects of Renaissance banquets: hygiene and personal care during the meal. You probably assumed people just showed up clean and that was that. But the truth is far more nuanced and sometimes downright fascinating. Mainstream historical fact. It was common practice for guests to carry their own small cloths or napkins called trencher cloths to wipe their hands and mouths during the meal, since forks didn't exist and eating with fingers was the norm. These cloths were often embroidered in a subtle way to display status. You notice that some nobles pull out these personal cloths with the same reverence they'd show a royal seal, probably a far cry from the napkin wiping habits you have on a lazy weekend. It's a dance of manners that you're trying hard to follow without offending anyone's delicate sensibilities. Quirky tidbit. Some wealthier guests even carried small personal spittoons or cups discreetly placed under the table, used to avoid public coughing or clearing their throats loudly, a surprisingly polite way to keep the banquet atmosphere civilized. You imagine the embarrassment of missing your spittoon and having to perform a dramatic spit in the corner. Historians still argue whether these hygiene customs were genuinely about cleanliness or more about social signaling, showing off one's refinement and control over bodily functions in a time when such control was a mark of nobility. Meanwhile, the absence of forks leads to all kinds of creative eating techniques. You watch as a noble delicately uses a knife to cut bite-sized pieces from a large roasted bird, carefully balancing each piece on a slice of bread, which doubles as a plate and utensil. That bread, called a trencher, soaked up sauces and juices and was often eaten last or sometimes given to the poor as a charitable act. You're fascinated by the fact that bread was such a multi-purpose tool plate, napkin, and food all rolled into one. You think about the crumbs already littering the floor, a silent testament to the reality beneath the gilded veneer. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some people kept a fork-like utensil called a prong or pick, but it was usually reserved for fruit or fancy dishes, and using it too openly could be seen as pretentious. You try to imagine the social faux pas of whipping out a prong too early and instantly becoming the talk of the court. The conversation shifts to the topic of hand washing. While it might seem obvious today, guests would often wash their hands before and after meals, sometimes even mid-meal, using basins and perfumed water brought by servants. This ritual wasn't just about cleanliness, it was also a moment to reset the palate and refresh the senses. You find yourself wondering how often those basins were actually changed, especially in large banquets with dozens of guests. Historians still debate whether these washing rituals genuinely improved hygiene or merely offered a fragrant illusion of cleanliness. By now, you're aware that Renaissance dining etiquette was less about strict rules and more about balancing practicality, social status, and a flair for the dramatic. Each gesture, each cloth folded just so, each subtle glance carried meaning beyond what meets the eye. You pause to imagine yourself back at that table, awkwardly balancing your trencher and cloth, trying not to spill the rich, spicy sauces while keeping an eye out for the occasional jester's prank. The whole experience feels like a delicate performance, requiring skill, patience, and a good sense of humor. You smile to yourself, appreciating the strange, charming messiness of it all. As the evening draws on, your attention shifts toward the rituals surrounding drinking at Renaissance banquets. You might think drinking was as simple as raising a glass and gulping down wine or ale, but in this world, imbibing was an art form and a minefield of etiquette. Mainstream historical fact. Toasting was a central part of the banquet's drinking culture. Guests would raise their goblets to honor the host, the monarch or particular guests often reciting formal speeches or poems. Refusing to toast could be seen as a grave insult, sometimes even sparking duels. You watch the host standing tall, voice steady as he toasts the king with a flourish. The room echoing with "to health and glory." It's a moment thick with ceremony, reminding everyone that even drinking was about power and politics. Quirky tidbit: drinking vessels ranged from simple wooden cups to elaborately gilded goblets studded with jewels. Some nobles took to decorating their personal cups with tiny bells or charms, partly to show off and partly to warn if their drink was tampered with. You imagine the poor servant tasked with cleaning these jingling cups without knocking over the entire table. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on toasting helped build camaraderie or simply reinforced rigid social hierarchies. You get the feeling it did a bit of both. Nothing brings people together like the shared risk of accidentally offending the wrong noble. You notice that the wine served was often diluted with water, a practice unfamiliar to modern tastes. The stronger, undiluted stuff was reserved for special occasions or the most important guests. You try a mental sip and imagine the taste somewhere between a sweet tonic and watered-down grape juice. Quirky tidbit number 2. In some regions, it was customary to drink from a communal cup passed around the table, forcing everyone to drink in turn and symbolizing unity. Of course, this wasn't the best idea during flu season, but social bonding trumped germs. The act of drinking also involved a specific posture, lifting the goblet with the right-hand elbow slightly raised and never slurping or gulping noisily. You watch a guest discreetly clean the rim of his cup before taking a sip, a little ritual to ensure no lingering crumbs or unpleasant flavors. At some banquets, guests were entertained by drinking songs, bawdy, or poetic verses encouraging merriment and cooperation. You chuckle quietly, imagining your quiet neighbors attempting to belt out such tunes without spilling their drinks. By now, the banqueters' inhibitions are lowered, but their manners still hold strong, a curious balance between revelry and restraint. You can't help but admire the elegance and complexity of this social dance, where every sip, every clink of glass is loaded with meaning. It dawns on you that Renaissance drinking etiquette wasn't about denying pleasure, but about framing it within a shared culture of respect, strategy, and of course, a bit of showmanship. You finish your imaginary goblet and prepare for the next course, whatever that might be, in this feast of sights, sounds, and social intrigue. The banquet's rhythm slow as you move into the final courses, but the dance of etiquette remains just as intricate. Now you find yourself observing the role of music and entertainment, essential threads woven into the fabric of Renaissance dining that elevated these gatherings beyond mere sustenance. Mainstream historical fact. Live music was a staple at noble banquets, minstrels, lutenists, and sometimes even small orchestras played to complement the meal. The music wasn't just background noise. It set moods, marked course changes, and encouraged dancing or other social rituals after eating. You can almost hear the delicate strumming of a lute mingling with the soft murmur of conversation, the gentle rustle of silk dresses as guests shift in their seats. The sounds create an immersive atmosphere where dining feels like an event to savor with every sense. Quirky tidbit. Sometimes performers included jesters or troubadours who specialized in mock courtships or playful satire. One favorite act involved a musician playing a terribly out-of-tune instrument on purpose, inviting guests to join in correcting him, an early form of interactive entertainment that might have embarrassed some but delighted others. Historians still argue whether music at banquets was more about reinforcing social order, keeping guests engaged and well-behaved, or genuinely fostering joy and creativity. Probably a little of both, with the musicians as subtle conductors of the evening's energy. You watch as a group of young nobles gather for a quick dance in a corner, carefully adhering to prescribed steps and posture, their movements graceful but clearly rehearsed. Dancing wasn't just fun, it was a demonstration of breeding and refinement. Quirky tidbit number 2. Sometimes banquets featured theatrical interludes, short plays, or tableaux vivants, where guests themselves might be recruited to perform or pose as allegorical figures. Imagine being asked to play spring while still clutching your goblet. Awkward but memorable. As the entertainment weaves through the night, the food becomes lighter and the mood more relaxed. Guests start to linger over small cups of spiced wine or digestives, the conversation turning to more personal topics, family, gossip, poetry, or the latest news from distant courts. You notice how the host skillfully shifts between roles: master of ceremonies, storyteller, diplomat. Every toast, every joke, every pause in the music is carefully orchestrated. You can't help but think back to the messy beginnings of the evening, the communal bread, the hand-washing rituals, the clumsy use of knives without forks. Somehow all those small moments add up to a night full of connection and subtle power plays. You sip your imaginary spiced wine, feeling the warmth spread, and realize that Renaissance banquets were far more than meals. They were performances, rituals, and social battlegrounds, all wrapped in a feast. You wonder what surprises the final section will hold as the evening finally winds down. Now, as the banquet begins to close, you find yourself drawn to the rituals and customs surrounding the departure of guests, a delicate, almost theatrical process that reflects the entire night's blend of manners, power, and human quirks. Mainstream historical fact: it was customary for hosts to present departing guests with small gifts known as parting gifts or favor boxes. These often included sweetmeats, spices, or scented sachets, and served as both a token of gratitude and a subtle reminder of the host's generosity and status. You watch as a noble lady carefully receives a tiny ornate box filled with candied ginger and rose petals. She offers a gracious nod, mindful that her reaction will be remembered and perhaps reported back to others. Every detail matters. Quirky tidbit: some gift boxes were rumored to contain secret messages or symbols like a pressed flower symbolizing affection or political allegiance. You wonder if these little tokens sometimes sparked as many intrigues as the grandest speeches. Historians still argue whether these parting gifts were genuinely heartfelt or mostly calculated gestures to maintain favor and influence within the tight-knit circles of Renaissance society. You suspect a clever mix of both, with just a hint of bribery. As guests gather their cloaks and prepare to leave, there's a noticeable shift in atmosphere, less formal but no less charged. Whispered conversations hint at alliances made or broken during the evening, while servants quietly clean and reset the grand hall, readying it for the next occasion. You recall the earlier chaos of eating with bare hands and the curious customs of washing mid-meal, the ceremonial toasts and elaborate sugar sculptures. All those moments feel like pieces of a puzzle that reveal a culture obsessed with appearances, status, and the fine art of social survival. The last sips of wine are taken, last jokes whispered, and finally guests step out into the night, leaving behind the warmth and clamor of the banquet hall. You take a slow breath, letting the sounds fade, the clink of silverware, the murmur of voices, the faint strains of a lute drifting through the air. The Renaissance banquet was never just about the food. It was a carefully choreographed experience where every bite, glance, and gesture was charged with meaning. And now, having walked through it with you, it feels less like a distant, dusty history and more like a living, breathing world you almost could have stumbled into. You feel a quiet satisfaction, a gentle tiredness and the slow pull of sleep. The strange, sticky, wonderful messiness of Renaissance dining has wrapped itself around your mind. Now as your eyes grow heavy, and the echoes of clinking goblets and murmured toasts begin to soften, let your mind drift slowly away from the grand halls and ornate tables of the Renaissance banquet. Imagine the warm glow of candlelight fading gently, the rich aromas of spiced wine and roasted meats settling into a calm, lingering whisper, the once bustling sounds of music and laughter quiet into a soft, distant hum, like a lullaby carried on a gentle breeze. There's comfort in knowing that even centuries ago, people gathered not just to eat, but to connect, to perform, and to share moments of human warmth and awkwardness much like we do today. Let your thoughts settle on the simple pleasures beneath the layers of ceremony, the softness of a cloth napkin, the taste of sweet candied ginger, the shy dance of a troubadour's song. As your breathing slows and your body sinks deeper into rest, remember that history, even the boring or messy parts, is alive with stories waiting to soothe and inspire. Let the night carry you into dreams where you sit quietly at those long wooden tables, a humble guest among whispered secrets and flickering shadows. Sleep well, wrapped in the gentle embrace of time past, knowing the banquet has ended, but the stories live on.